the science and the humanities kind of operate in isolation, and that there's not necessarily an integration of, like medical school, like, hard sciences, whatever. And they're not necessarily taking courses in the humanities that discuss these types of issues. And so if people are being educated in these fields and their professors aren't, well-versed in these issues, the students aren't becoming well-versed in those issues, then the next generation of, scholars are not going to be well-versed in those issues.
So today's topic is the history of scientific and medical racism in America, and a brief description of the talk. So from the experiments conducted on enslaved black women by J. Marion Sims, to the Tuskegee syphilis study, to the creation of phrenology, American medical institutions conducted unethical medical practices and created racist pseudoscientific ideas that impacted black American communities for hundreds of years. Today, numerous studies have revealed that there are pernicious racial biases that persist in medicine, impacting the quality of care that healthcare providers administer to black Americans and contributing to the large disparity between health outcomes for black and white patients in this country. Even when controlled for wealth, education, insurance status, and other access-related factors, black Americans as well as other racial and ethnic minorities receive a lower quality of healthcare. So in this talk, we're really excited to welcome Udodiri Okwandu. She is a PhD student in the History of Science Department at Harvard University. Her research explores the intersection of race and class, public health policy, social justice, and mental and reproductive health in 20th and 21st century American society. And her current project right now examines attempts in the 1960s to characterize civil rights protest methods as signs of a neurological disorder by the white scientific medical community. And so in today's talk, she will be exploring the historical relationship between medical and scientific institutions and race in American society. And so she'll be looking at some case studies from the 19th century to the present, and she'll shed light on the ways in which problematic conceptualizations of race have contributed to health disparities among black Americans. So please join me in welcoming Udodiri Okwandu right now.
So thank you so much for those introductions. It truly is a pleasure to be here with you all today. The title of my talk is The History of Medical and Scientific Racism in America. However, before I begin, I think it's important to note two things. First, my talk today does not provide an exhaustive history. If I attempted to provide one, we would all be sitting here for an extremely long time. So what I'm doing my best is to highlight what I believe are some significant illustrative cases in that history. Secondly, while my presentation focuses exclusively on the impact of scientific and medical racism on black people, it is important to note first that many other minority populations in America have been historically marginalized and exploited by these discourses. And secondly, that medical and scientific racism is not exclusively an American phenomenon, but instead occurs also on a global scale. So I'm going to begin by describing three real scenarios, and I ask that as you listen to them, you think about the common thread that ties them together. In the 19th century, a physician argues that enslaved Africans who attempt to run away are suffering from a mental illness. In the 20th century, thousands of economically disadvantaged and overwhelmingly black women are coerced by federally funded health centers into getting sterilized. At the turn of the 21st century, the US government considers funding a research project that suggests that primarily black and brown urban youth are genetically predisposed to acts of violence. What do these three cases, separated by time and subject matter, have in common? All three are part of a long tradition of scientific and medical racism in the United States, a tradition that has relied on ideas of race, more specifically racial difference, in order to privilege some racial groups at the expense of marginalizing others, such as black Americans. Scientific racism describes attempts to co-opt the authority of science in order to justify racial prejudice, racial discrimination, and notions of racial superiority or inferiority. Medical racism can be viewed as a consequence of scientific racism and refers to prejudice and discrimination in medicine and the healthcare system based upon individuals' race. Central to both scientific and medical racism is the legitimization of race as a category that can indicate the inherent inferiority or superiority of a particular group. Race is a product of culture and human imagination, or in other words, it is socially constructed. When we identify and label people as a particular race, we are referring to groups of humans separated by artificial boundaries, such as shared physical characteristics or social qualities, that can change depending on time, geographies, and socio-political context. However, just because race itself is an unstable, constructed category, that does not mean that its impact is not real. In fact, the construction of racial identities has historically been imposed by dominating groups to maintain unequal power dynamics and reinforce the oppression of the historically marginalized. We see the persistence of this trend as we examine the relationship between scientific and medical institutions, race, and the exploitation and marginalization of Black Americans throughout American history. Throughout the 18th century, physicians and scientists in Europe and the United States discussed and attempted to define racial differences, largely in an attempt to justify the existence of slavery in the Americas, the colonial system, and global imperialism. What is surprising is that the origins of this scientific and medical discourse is rooted in manipulations to Christian theology as a means to understand the origins of man. During this period, physicians and scientists were plagued by whether or not all humans were descendants of Adam and Eve. From this question stem two dominant schools of thought: monogenesis and polygenesis, both of which reinforced the idea that Black people were savages and racially, intellectually, and physically inferior. Monogenesis theory argues that all humans were descended from Adam and Eve and descended again from Noah and his sons following the Great Flood. However, physicians and scientists explain differences between the races based on the unequal distribution of sin after the lineage of Ham, one of Noah's sons, was cursed. According to the book of Genesis, Ham's lineage was cursed because he walked in on his father drunk and unclothed. After Noah found out about Ham's transgression, he told him that he would curse the lineage of Ham's son, Canaan, destining them to a life of enslavement. Meanwhile, he blessed the lineage of his other sons, Japheth and Shem. While the book of Genesis never says that Ham was Black, or the races of Noah's other sons, the symbol of Ham was manipulated so that he became associated with black skin, while Japheth and Shem became associated with whiteness. Thus, the curse of Ham was used to justify Black enslavement and their perceived inferiority, since according to their interpretations of the Bible, they were morally transgressive people. Polygenesis, on the other hand, did not necessarily agree with the curse of Ham narrative. That is because polygenesis theory argues that the lower races, such as Black people, were not descendants of Adam and Eve, or Noah for that matter. Instead, they were an entirely separate species with different lineages. For example, Harvard biologist Louis Agassiz argued that Black people were created along with other beasts and animals in the Garden of Eden. While theoretically different than monogenism, polygenism similarly operated to justify the enslavement and oppression of Black people by denying them the right to be considered human beings. Throughout this period, attempts were made on both sides to support their theories and racial difference and Black inferiority more generally with scientific and anthropological evidence. For example, the pseudoscience phrenology, which attempts to link skull bump measurements to mental traits, emerged and was used to justify racist beliefs. By comparing skulls of different ethnic groups, it supposedly allowed for a ranking of races from least to most evolved. Physicians like Charles Caldwell used phrenology to prove that African people were in their rightful place as slaves because their skulls suggested a natural timidness that required them to have a master. Examining skulls also played a central role in the development of the American School of Anthropology, which was largely rooted in giving scientific authority to pro-slavery forces. For example, physician Samuel G. Morton argued that he could define the intellectual ability of a race by their skull capacity. He contended that whites had the largest skulls, while Black people had the smallest skulls among all races, thus making them intellectually inferior and rightfully enslaved. This slide depicts images from Morton's Crania Americana, which was published in 1839. Morton argued that racial differences were actually distinctions between separate species. In his drawing on the left, you can see that he is suggesting that Black people are more similar externally and internally to apes, thus reinforcing the idea that they are animalistic and mentally and physically inferior. His depiction of the white male, on the other hand, is presented in direct opposition to these images and aimed to suggest their humanesse, civilized nature, and superiority. In reality, Morton's depictions are gross misrepresentations and caricatures of real human beings. The chart on the right displays detailed recordings of skull measurements from the varying races. The averages, according to Morton, demonstrate that Black people have the smallest average cranial size. Other physicians, such as Samuel Cartwright, came up with a variety of physical and mental conditions that affected slaves if they were granted freedom. Among them was a condition he called drapetomania, or the desire to flee servitude. Cartwright likened drapetomania to a mental disorder similar to madness and argued that slaves should be kept in a submissive state and treated like children to prevent and cure them from running away. He also argued that slavery was healthy for Black people because it gave them discipline and direction, sparing them from their innate savagery. The proliferation of ideas about Black people's biologically based inferiority left them vulnerable to racist scientific and medical discourses, unethical experimentation, and exploitation from the medical and scientific establishments during this period and beyond. These ideas degraded the humanity of Black people, robbing them of autonomy and respectful treatment by these institutions. The remainder of this talk will highlight a few cases that I think demonstrate the legacy of scientific and medical racism and its impact on Black communities. So my first case study is going to examine the work of James Marion Sims, a 19th century physician who is credited as the father of modern gynecology. Among his biggest contributions to the field is his development of the speculum, which is a tool used for dilation and examination, and pioneering a surgical technique to repair vaginal fistula, which is a catastrophic complication of childbirth that was common among 19th century women. However, Sims' contributions did not come without a cost that resulted in the repeated degradation, exploitation, and abuse of Black female slaves who became his unwilling experimental subjects. In order to understand the problematic nature of Sims' work, it is important to understand the relationship between the development of gynecology and the slave trade. After Congress banned the importation of African slaves in 1808, American slave owners acquired a more vested interest in increasing the number of slave births in the United States. As a result, the value of female slaves extended beyond their working capacity on the plantation, but their ability to reproduce. Consequently, conditions like vaginal fistula, which compromised female slaves' reproductive capacities, were considered a huge problem for those invested in the institution of slavery. Sims' gynecological practice grew directly in response to this need. He began experimenting with surgical techniques to treat vaginal fistulas in 1845 on Black female slaves. While during this period anesthesia was experimental, physicians were increasingly using it during surgical operations. Sims, however, did not. His resistance to anesthesia was not due to speculation of its effectiveness, but instead was rooted in his racist belief that Black people did not feel pain. Thus, slave women such as Anarcha, who was subjected to over 30 experimental operations over the course of 4 years, was subject to incredible pain and suffering in order for Sims to perfect his technique. Once perfected, Sims began to operate on white women with anesthesia. The case of James Marion Sims demonstrates a clear example of scientific and medical racism, as it demonstrates how ideas of racial inferiority turned Black women into expendable, exploitable, experimental subjects. The next case I will examine, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, provides another example of unethical experimentation on Black subjects. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service began a study to record the natural history of untreated syphilis in Black men in Macon County, Alabama. What was intended to be a 6-month study ended up lasting for 40 years. From the start of the experiment, researchers engaged in unethical research practices. Rather than telling them the true purpose of the study, participants were told that they were being treated for bad blood, a local term used to describe several ailments, including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. Bad blood specifically, the collection of illnesses the term included, was a leading cause of death within the Southern African American community. Additionally, researchers took advantage of the fact that the population they were recruiting, impoverished African American sharecroppers, had limited to no access to healthcare and resources. Thus, they lured their participants into the study by promising free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. You may be wondering what factors led to public health service researchers to intentionally deceive and exploit their African American research participants. For one, researchers at Public Health Service were largely influenced by prevailing cultural and scientific assumptions that shaped ideas about race and disease. In fact, many Public Health Service researchers received their medical training when eugenic understandings of race were central to their education. Thus, the meaning of bad blood meant more than just a disease, but instead reflected moral and medical inferiority and inordinate sexual appetite in those afflicted. Additionally, many researchers believe that syphilis disproportionately affected Black people. As stated by Public Health Service member Raymond A. Vonderlehr, our present information indicates definite biological differences in the disease, syphilis, in Negroes and whites. There was a dominant belief that this Negro disease would spread to white people. Thus, researchers at the Public Health Service were motivated to fully understand the effects of untreated syphilis on the human body. At the time that researchers began the experiment, there was no known treatment for syphilis. However, by the 1940s, penicillin became the recommended treatment to cure the disease. One would think that the emergence of a cure for syphilis would conclude the study. It did not. Instead, the Tuskegee scientists continued the study without treating the patients with penicillin and withheld information about a cure from them. Tuskegee researchers made an active choice to complete their goal of tracking the disease's full progression, a goal that was pursued without their subjects' informed consent, even as the men died, went blind or insane, or experienced other severe health problems due to their untreated syphilis. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment highlights the complex and problematic relationship between race and science and provides an example of a clear disregard for Black human life, in which experimental results are more important than upholding the medical and scientific establishment's supposed commitment to do no harm. My next case study examines the history of compulsory sterilizations and eugenics programs and their effects on the Black community. Compulsory sterilization programs refer to government policies which force people to undergo surgical or other forms of sterilization without their consent that would permanently end their ability to reproduce. Throughout the 20th century, 32 states had federally funded sterilization programs, as demonstrated in this slide. The first compulsory sterilization programs emerged at the end of the 19th century during the Progressive Era for the purpose of eugenics. Eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aims at improving the genetic quality of a human population by controlling reproduction. Central to eugenics was the idea of biological determinism, which argues that physical, mental, and behavioral defects such as poverty, criminality, alcoholism, and bearing children out of wedlock to be unalterable, inheritable traits. Eugenists were particularly concerned with the costs associated with caring for people with behavioral defects such as these, who would financially burden the government and taxpayers. Thus, eugenic thought came to influence politics and social policies through the implementation of involuntary sterilization laws. Eugenic thought emerged in the United States in response to industrialization, urbanization, and the mass immigration of Eastern and Southern Europeans, who at the time did not fall into our modern conceptualization of white. In response to these changes, white native-born Americans became concerned that the unfit would take over the country and thus became motivated to preserve their social, economic, and political power. The targets of eugenic thought, however, shifted beginning in the 1950s in response to social anxieties, including but not limited to demands by the Black community for racial equality, welfare expansion, the creation of anti-poverty programs, and increasing Mexican and Puerto Rican immigration. While eugenic rhetoric was less explicit, compulsory sterilization during this period was still rooted in the belief that social defects were reproduced. However, the method of transmission shifted from genes to culture. Among the worst cases of forced sterilization took place in North Carolina at the hands of the state's official eugenics board, which was active from 1929 to 1974 and sterilized 7,600 people during that time period. The board's targets were disproportionately Black and female and almost always poor. Another example of forced sterilization takes place in Sunflower County, Mississippi, where during the 1960s, 60% of Black female residents were sterilized at Sunflower City Hospital without their permission. In both cases, physicians felt that they were performing a service to the woman and society at large by sterilizing them without their consent. The reality, however, is that these physicians relied on racialized discourses to justify their actions and dehumanize their victims. As aptly stated in 2014 by Margaret Rankin, whose sister Deborah was sterilized at 14 years old in the early 1970s by the North Carolina Eugenics Board. They labeled us as poor people, uneducated, Black, feeble-minded, and thus worthy of sterilization. The final case that I'm going to discuss is actually the focus of one of my own research projects, which examines attempts by the scientific and medical community to categorize civil rights protests as signs of a neurological disorder in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In my work, I specifically focus on the claims put forth by 3 Harvard doctors, Vernon Mark, William Sweet, and Frank Irvin, and how the government's interest in their work was rooted in attempts to suppress political dissent and reinforce Black people's status as second-class citizens. In order to understand what would lead doctors to make such a claim, it is important to understand the social and political context in which their claims arose. Historians have examined how the 1960s marked increased concerns regarding public and personal safety, particularly among white Americans. These fears, however, were not limited to things such as violent crime, but extended to rapid social changes such as the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement encompassed a diversity of protest methods and traditions, ranging from civil disobedience to organized protest to full-on riots. Additionally, the movement witnessed calls for racial solidarity through ideas such as Black power and Black consciousness. These changes, however, were a source of apprehension. According to research conducted by social scientists during this period, many white Americans associated strides for Black equality with Black domination or contemporary unrest and considered it incomprehensible and intolerable. Sentiments towards civil rights protests and riots set the stage for the rise of law and order political ideology, which calls for stricter and more punitive approaches against crime. Within this context, civil rights protest methods, specifically more confrontational ones such as riots, were not understood as responses to sustained social, political, and economic oppression, but instead as senseless, violent behavior. A look through the congressional record shows politicians describing this behavior as anti-ethical to American values, and they also emphasize the supposed victimization of white Americans as a result of these protest methods. These attitudes resulted in an association between civil rights protests and violent criminal behavior, reinforcing historical tropes that characterize Black people as uncivilized savages prone to anger. In my research, I argue that Drs. Mark, Sweet, and Irvin's claims were deeply influenced by these social anxieties and constructions of civil rights protests as senseless violence. In 1967, they published an article titled "The Role of Brain Disease in Riots and Urban Violence," in which they explicitly assert that rioters may be suffering from brain dysfunction. They even went on to say that by focusing on the socioeconomic contributors to rioting, such as poverty, slum housing, and limited education opportunities, society was overlooking the tremendous impact of biological factors on riots. Mark, Irvin, and Sweet's claims reinforced the dominant public and political discourse that civil rights protest was not a legitimate response to oppression, but instead was unwarranted and senseless. This belief was so pervasive that the United States Justice Department funded doctors Mark Irvin and Sweet's research, at one point allocating them $500,000. The political nature of their work is exemplified by a quote made by Irving himself in 1970. "We're really talking about being socially cost-effective. If you can work out a way to define, diagnose, treat, and even prevent a problem, you're going to save a lot of money." That urban rioting and violence in African American communities came to be understood as the product of a brain disease, as the fight for Black equality became assertive and unrelenting, was not a product of chance. The investigation of surgical means for the treatment and prevention of violence was deeply embedded in and influenced by the socio-political context in which it arose. Arguably, the doctors and the political bodies that supported them contributed to the depoliticization of the civil rights movement. Rather than being justified in taking a stand against racist social, political, and economic policies, protesters' actions would simply be viewed as the product of having a brain disorder. This historical moment reveals the complicated relationship that exists between science and politics, and the ways in which this relationship can further marginalize and dehumanize Black communities. So it would be easy to say that the cases I have described today are mere deviations when we consider the broader historical relationship between scientific and medical institutions and the Black community. It would be even easier to say that these cases have no bearing on the contemporary relationship between race, medicine, and science. The reality, however, is that it is not easy. The legacy of scientific and medical racism continues to work insidiously today, resulting in persistent racial biases in medical practice and scientific investigations. It is why scientists continue to investigate as late as the 1990s supposed racial differences in intelligence, arguing that Black people are genetically predisposed to having lower IQs. It is why during the 1990s crack cocaine epidemic, policies demonized and criminalized Black American drug users rather than humanizing and rehabilitating them, rendering their pain and suffering and the socio-political and economic conditions that contributed to drug abuse invisible. It is why Black mothers are 4 times more likely to die from childbirth than white women, even when socioeconomic status, education, and other factors are matched, because their physical complaints and concerns during pregnancy are largely ignored. It is why Black people are less likely to receive treatment for pain than whites, because many doctors still hold on to the belief that Black people are less likely to feel pain, or that if they are given drugs like opioids to treat their pain, they will abuse them. It is why it is easier for society to blame persistent health disparities in Black communities on their own personal choices, rather than reflecting on the effects of institutionalized and systemic racism and social, political, and economic disenfranchisement. During the course of my work, I often reflect on a quote that is attributed to Mark Twain. "History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme." Our historical past has a massive bearing on not only our present, but also our future. Thus, history serves as a useful tool to recognize the dangers that can emerge when racial biases, science, medicine, and politics converge. Rather than promoting equality, they can reinforce institutionalized inequality and compromise the health and well-being of the most vulnerable populations. My hope is that in examining the historical and contemporary legacies of scientific and medical racism, we can build scientific and medical institutions that no longer reinforce racial injustice, prejudice, and discrimination, but instead work actively to dismantle them. Thank you.
So right now we're going to transition to the Q&A portion of the evening. So
Cool.
This mic will rotate around the room. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Please try to keep your question brief. All right, no comment first and then questions. Get your question out there so we can hear from as many people as possible during this segment of the talk. All right?
So, like looking into the future as personalized medicine becomes more advanced, as like genetic testing and like sequencing becomes cheaper and more accessible, do you see more of these trends like surfacing, or kind of the culture becoming more educated about like these biases and recognizing them and trying to combat that?
Yeah, so I definitely will say that in recent years there's been an increased emphasis on the social determinants of health, So things such as where you're raised, like economic status, education levels, and the impact on health. I think the issue with personalized medicine and genetic testing is if it's happening in isolation from those conversations, and if people are still lapsing into this, the term I called earlier was biological determinism, that our genes is the only thing that can determine our, whether or not we get sick and the types of illnesses that we receive. So I'm still deciding on my views specifically on genetic testing, but I only think it's dangerous if it's used in isolation, and that if you're ignoring social determinants of health, then that's where you're running into problems, because so much of sickness today is an effect of where you live, where you're growing up, whether you're in a food desert, like what type of education you're receiving, like, things such as that, like whether your environment has increased levels of environmental pollution and things such as that, things that individuals can't necessarily control. And so if we're ignoring all that, and then we're saying that people are just sick because their genes say they are, we're lapsing into racialized discourses that aren't necessarily true and don't paint the full picture.
How did you come to choose this research as your field, and kind of what brought you to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think partially my interest in, issues of race just kind of stemmed from my own lived experiences as a Black woman who has experienced racism in America. So that's one side. But then also growing up, I wanted to be a doctor, but I quickly threw away that dream when I was in college because I hate science and ironically, I studied the history of science and medicine, but I hate science. Like, I hate biology, I hate chemistry, anyways. So during my sophomore year of college, I took my first history of science class called Medical Ethics and History, and I realized that that was exactly where I wanted to be. Not necessarily engaging in practice, but thinking about the ways in which history and reflecting on our historical past can help us influence and shape the ways in which we have contemporary medical and scientific discourses. And so for the girl like me who hates science and understands the impact of racism in American society, and also was vaguely interested in medicine and health, was able to combine those three things together, and that's what kind of landed me in a PhD program in history of science studying these issues. But yeah.
I wondered if we could go back to the slide of the United States.
Yeah, sure.
Which ones were ratifying.
Yeah.
And if you have any additional comments, but I also wasn't sure what the blank states represented.
Oh, yeah. So I probably should have explained this slide. So basically this slide examines the legal status of eugenic sterilizations in the US. So the states that have the slash lines, those were states that already had laws in effect by 1935. The ones with the dark that are black, those are the states with pending bills that would eventually pass in the next couple of years. And then the white states were those that did not have any eugenic sterilization laws during the time that this image was created. Yeah.
I'm a medical student, and often we're learning, or still learning, that genetics are a lot of the reasons we're seeing some disparities, even though science has disproven it many times. One of the most common examples is we're taught that there's two different types of blood pressure medication regimens to give to Black patients and white patients, and there's so much data. So I guess my question is, in your experience, is there a way to sort of frame this to to move the conversation away from genetics because the data itself isn't working, or what do you think the next steps are to move away from in such a evidence-based field not using evidence as we're doing?
I think, and of course I'm not a scientific or medical expert, but I think in my experience one of the things I've seen as a problem is that the science and the humanities kind of operate in isolation, and that there's not necessarily an integration of, medical school, hard sciences, whatever. And they're not necessarily taking courses in the humanities that discuss these types of issues. And so if people are being educated in these fields and their professors aren't, well-versed in these issues, the students aren't becoming well-versed in those issues, then the next generation of, scholars are not going to be well-versed in those issues. So I think if those programs can come up with some type of way to, maybe have mandatory teaching requirements on social determinants of health and other, non-scientific genetic impacts of disease, that could be one step to start to unlearn these biologically determined discourses that have been permeating through the sciences of medicine.
Thank you again for the presentation. It was great.
Thanks.
Branching off of the last question, so it's really important to integrate medical humanities research into teaching the next generation of doctors. But I was wondering what's sort of the next step in terms, because you don't need to just teach the doctors, you also need to influence politicians in order to change policy. Like, for example, teaching doctors isn't going to help the Flint water crisis. So how exactly do you see bridging that next step from teaching the next class of doctors into influencing policy?
That's a great question. A big question, but I'll try my best to answer. So yeah, that's definitely a discrepancy. I think my initial inclination is to say that, we have to get involved in politics. We need to be talking to our politicians. We need to be calling in. Because I think, at least the way I'm understand it, is that, politicians kind of decide what they want to study, what issues they care about, and that oftentimes it takes grassroots movements and literally the people to kind of push those ideas forward and kind of shape the direction in which our policies in America are going to go. So that would be my first answer, but I'd have to think about that more. That's a good question. Yeah.
Hi, Udo. Thank you for your presentation. It was really amazing, important work that you're doing. I'm interested in just the number of times you sort of mentioned Harvard professors in particular, and just at Harvard academics. So what that means for you as someone who is at Harvard in challenging what has happened. Do you go back into those archives and say, hey, do we need to disprove? Because I think Agassi is I think his institution is still up and running. I don't know if that's really challenged at Harvard. So what does it mean for you to be doing work that also speaks directly to what Harvard professors have done?
It's definitely a bit of cognitive dissonance, walking around an institution that in many ways glorifies these figures from the past. Like, there's literally a building at Harvard. Our student admissions hall is called Agassi Center. The guy I mentioned that said that black people were created alongside other beasts in the Garden of Eden. Like, that's racist, and that's a problem. So I would say there's definitely been steps by students to try to challenge, the naming of buildings at our school and those legacies. But I think one of the most important things that I've appreciated, at least during my time here, is an acknowledgement, at least, that our anthropology department was literally rooted upon justifying the existence of slavery. Like, that was how our anthropology department at Harvard was created. And so I think it's gonna take time, but it's definitely a dissonance experience. At least just my experience as a grad student, I try to find support from those that, understand me. I try to be honest about my experience in the department if I'm having problems, or if I'm feeling uncomfortable, or if I'm things like that. And for the most part, it's well received. So I think it's just a work in progress. Like, these institutions have been around for hundreds of years, and old habits die hard. And they will hold on to those names for as long as they can. But I think if we continue to challenge it, definitely at some point, hopefully, we can reverse that.
I'm curious, the science, such as it is, of phrenology, how is that applied to mixed race people?
Yeah, interesting. So so during that period, so for the most part, for most of American history, at least during the 19th, 20th, early 20th century, if you had one drop of black, you were black. And so it didn't matter if if your dad was half white and black, and then you had multiple white people in your lineage, you were black if you were black. So a lot of the discourses that I discussed would also apply to mixed race people, which also, during the time period, there was a lot of efforts to prevent racial mixing for that very problem, because they believed the mixing of white and black people created these deformed human beings. And so they didn't like mixed race people, which they called mulattoes, which is an outdated term, don't use it. So I'll tell you that. So they didn't like them, but they applied the same types of ideals to them during the time period.
I was curious what your thoughts were on the popularization or conversation surrounding the Henrietta Lacks
book and movie, and also if you had any thoughts about what should be done to make things less terrible for the Lax family.
Yeah, so for, I guess, those not familiar with the Lax case, I'll do my best to briefly summarize. Basically, in the 20th century, a black woman went in for a routine, like, I think a uterine swab for cancer. The doctors ended up harvesting her cells. Her cells never died, and the people that harvested her cells basically became rich. Her family was poverty-stricken and never got any of the money that was made off of her cells. So my thoughts on the book, the movie, etc. I'm glad that education is happening. I think it's important for people to know the ways in which, bodies are literally exploited and monetized, throughout by our scientific and medical establishments. I hope it's a continual push for more, because I think one of my qualms oftentimes with discourses about scientific and medical racism, that people pick like 3 cases and they're like, I know the history, I know Gila, I know Tuskegee, I know J. Marion Sims, and I fell into that trap today because, it would be easier. But, so hopefully it's the start of larger discourses and discussions about, the enduring legacy of scientific and medical racism, because, a lot of this is even in our recent past. Like, I discussed cases from the 1960s, 1990s, even as early as the 2000s, I have, there's cases on that. So I'm hoping it creates a wider conversation, also creates more ethical research and medical practices in, by these institutions. And then was there a second half of your question? They should be compensated. I don't know how all those laws work. I'm not a lawyer, but so there's probably somewhere written in legal code that justifies them not being compensated for their family members' cells, but they should be compensated. She should have been compensated. She should have been informed that her cells are being taken without her use and harvested for years, and has literally helped cure so many diseases in society. Like, it's not okay that her family is literally living in poverty. And people are just sitting there rich off of her body. So that's my take. I don't know how, I think there was a legal battle for at some point, and they didn't win. But I'm hoping the author may have maybe given them some money from the book she wrote. I'm not sure if that happened, or if the movie that they created, they gave them some money, but I think that would be the right thing to do. Yeah.
How do you think an increase in diversity in medical practitioners would affect how people are treated?
I think it could help. If we're talking about, I think increased diversity can help, but there are still incidences in which diverse medical practitioners are biased towards their patients. I have several examples from myself in which I've been treated by, ethnic, medical doctors and have been treated horribly. And I'm sure other people as well have experienced that. So again, I think it goes down to not only diversifying our education system and people that are becoming doctors, but also diversifying our medical curriculum and actually actively trying to unlearn the biases that persisted in medicine for literally hundreds of years. And until we do that, we can make incremental change by having more diverse, medical and scientific establishment. But if the curriculum's not changing, if ideology is not changing, then we're going to be taking 1 step forward, 3 steps back, and it's just going to be so slow. So that's my thoughts on that.
So first off, terrific talk.
Thanks.
Love you. So we've spoken a lot about how there needs to be somewhat of a revamping of kind of the education that people in the medical or scientific communities need to undertake. But I wonder if you can speak to kind of the importance of ethnic minorities getting more educated about these biases and kind of the kind of social factors that might be influencing their health outcomes, so that kind of when they do encounter a medical professional, that they're aware that, okay, more than likely you're not going to give me this medication, more than likely you're going to treat my birth like this. If you could just speak a little bit to kind of the importance of being educated when walking into one of those institutions.
That's also a very good point, because the unfortunate reality is that these institutions are progressing slowly in terms of their ability to effectively and unbiasedly treat their patients. So yeah, it is important for minority patients to be aware of what they could be encountering in a clinical setting. The only thing I wonder is in which avenue that would be best effective. Where would they learn how to advocate for themselves and recognize bias in the clinical setting. I was fortunate to have a mom who's a nurse who has told me no, you're going to demand this. You demand this when you go to the doctor's office. Oh, they told you this. No, don't listen to them. And so I had an informal education in that area. So yeah, I know there's some smaller nonprofits that do things like that. I was involved in one in Boston that actually what their goal was to educate Black women on health issues and how to better engage in clinical settings, but I'm just not sure how widespread and common those things actually are. But that's a very important point. I guess in terms of starting, it's all about making education more accessible, but Googling, but it's people need to be first made aware that it's an issue. But I agree that patient education is also equally as important as, well, they shouldn't have to educate themselves, but it's currently just as important as medical and scientific institutions becoming less biased. Good point.
Thank you for the talk. Sort of going off that question, just hearing your talk and thinking about how slow institutions are to change as time goes on, and thinking about having that change be from the patient end of things. Have you thought maybe about what are some ways we can make talks like your talk available to bigger, wider groups of people? So thinking about media, film, have you thought about ways to widen the conversation?
I haven't thought too much about that, but I think one way could be to identify areas in which, we may think clinician bias is occurring at a high rate, and maybe actively going to areas where large portions of the community congregate, maybe YMCA or the recreational center, and advertising those things and having informal events. I know media campaigns are also very important. The youth loves Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Everyone likes it. So that could also be an important way as well to spread information, but my question would then be who would be funding this and who would be pushing efforts to educate the public on the fact that they need to be aware of issues that they can encounter in the clinical setting. That's something I'd also need to think further about. Something I often think about is how can I make my work more accessible to people, and kind of deconstruct the academic tower and make it accessible to the broader population. And I've seen some ways people do that is by publishing in more mainstream magazines that people actually read. Informal blogs could be one way. But again, there needs to be a lot of intentionality about making sure that those communities are actually accessing it and reading it and intaking the information.
Hello.
Hi.
Did amazing. So just out of curiosity, I was wondering, so say in a perfect case scenario, institutions, governments make, of course, appropriate changes to influence bias. How important do you think it is to also, I guess, really engage and really kind of tap into the individual biases that are still in local communities? Because I think it's one thing if, I don't know, for example, a medical school was more diverse in theory, but if the individuals that are entering that program per se still are coming from all over the country with their own perceived notions from their environments, their parents, which, it's a sickle down effect from generations. How does that, I guess, play into a change in the bias that we see overall?
Yeah, changing the individual. That's, the easy but very difficult answer to that would be we need a broad culture shift in American society. We need to, abandon the notion that we're in this post-racial society in which racism doesn't exist, because color blindness is also I believe, a form of racism. And so one, we need to combat the fact that I don't know where this education would have, like maybe the school system as young as elementary school. I don't know how that's gonna happen, but there needs to be concerted effort to, you know, reject this notion that we're in a post-racial society. Racism very much still exists, and just because it's not, you know, we have a black bathroom and a white bathroom, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and that doesn't mean it's not as dangerous. So yeah, I think the individual, if we're really talking like how can we get individuals to change, it's going to start when you're young, and I think it's going to start while students are, you know, starting to engage with other people, which is like elementary school, middle school. I don't know about you guys, I didn't have any discussions on race, biases, discrimination where I grew up. I don't think anyone did, so I think that would be an important area to help start creating that change. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Given the terrible history that exists in medicine and between people of color, there's this huge distrust that people of color have towards their healthcare professionals. And you touched on this a little bit, but what do you think is the best, most immediate step that healthcare professionals can take to address that distrust and foster a better patient-physician relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one way in which I think the distrust is justified, right? Like we went over, like yeah, it's justified. But I think, as corny as this may sound, first impressions are everything. So if your first encounter with a clinical professional is problematic, or it makes you feel weird, or bad about yourselves, then like that's just going to reinforce that cycle of distrust. So I think, you know, doctors need to really think critically without being, you know, like patronizing to their minority patients, that like I need to make sure that this is like a healthy, safe, non-problematic encounter with my patient. And it's going to take intentionality and thoughtfulness on the part of physicians. But that's my first hunch, just off the bat. Yeah, thanks.
So I work in the industry in science, and I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, it's not even close to being, like, racist notions in science are absolutely not even close to, like, being out of our, like, forefront of our minds. So what is something that, like, people like me who want to be cognizant of these things, how can we call it out? Like, do we just say, like, your research is shit?
I wish. I don't want you to lose your job. Yeah, so I think this question kind of comes down to like allyship, like how can we advocate and you support, you know, underrepresented minorities, and help create less racialized science and discourses. I mean, if you're noticing something problematic with a colleague's work, I think just sitting them down and having I mean, people shouldn't have to not be aggressive, but you know, people don't respond well to aggression. I don't even like that word. But just having a conversation that's backed with fact. I think historical fact is a very important way to back off, to substantiate why something can be problematic. Like, you know, if we're talking about like contemporary maternal death rates in Black women, you can point to specific historical examples as to like why this is a persistent trend. So I think if you just come in educated, firm, and just have the courage to call people out if you think something is a problem, I think that's a very important and critical step that most people aren't taking, which is why ridiculous articles are still being published to this day, because no one's talking, and then also because these spaces are more often than not, they're not diverse. So the likelihood of people talking about these issues or viewing it as problematic is slimmer. So yeah, I think having the courage to speak is important.
Clock. We are wrapping up. Big thanks again to Udodiri Okwandu again for her presentation. Yeah, applause. Yeah. Again, thank you all for coming out this evening. Really appreciate your comments and your questions. Please, I think Udodiri will be here for a couple more minutes if people have additional questions. Also, we didn't really talk about this, but if there are any books or recommendations or things you'd encourage people to check out if they're interested in learning more about this topic, or?
Yeah, actually, I wrote down a few that are relevant. Should I just say them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, let me come to the front. Sorry. So I guess ones that are relevant to this talk would be Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts, Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, Body and Soul by Alondra Nelson, Fit to be Tied by Rebecca Kluchin, and Examining Tuskegee by Susan Reverby, and also some of the work by David Williams on racial inequalities and health, and Helena Hansen has a lot of interesting discussions on the contemporary opioid epidemic and the issues with race that are persisting throughout it. So, yeah.
Thank you all again for coming out. If you guys reach under your seat, I think two people might have